speaker today is Dr. Roger Kangas. Roger's no stranger to KU. He's been out here several times. He generally bats cleanup with the security conference that we do. So if you're by and you want to have a chance to see him speak again, then show up tomorrow afternoon. He is academic dean and professor of Central Asian Studies at the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. He has, if you look at his previous jobs, he's got a long and impressive list. He's served as professor of Central Asian Studies at the Marshall Center in Europe, as the deputy director at Central Asian Institute at the School of Advanced International Studies, or as we probably know it, SAIS. Also the Central Asian Course Coordinator at the Foreign Service Institute for the U.S. Department of State. And a number of other, I think you've been an advisor to everybody from IREX to American councils to the U.S. government, and is also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. So his topic today is the future of U.S. engagement in Central Asia beyond security.
Okay, excellent. And thank you so much, Bart, and thank you all for coming here today. As said, I'll be at the conference tomorrow, and what I like to do is, if it's possible, to maybe have a chance to speak, in another setting, and so to get some time here to be part of your Brownbag series is really positive. I'm going to give one quick warning as we get started. I spent probably the last week and a half in China, actually dealing with their Central Asianists. And in Beijing, the air quality was so bad, I picked up a really nice hack. So I may be hacking up a lung as we go through here today. People on the plane are all like, okay, what's this guy's problem? Now, they had a thing with the EPA, whatever the metrics are, they say the air quality is at this score of 35 or above. Cities need to have an emergency plan. That includes, like obviously the Los Angeles and New Yorks of the world. In Beijing last week, it was 300. You see the people with the mask. It looks like something out of Blade Runner if you're a science fiction fan. Because it wasn't cloudy, it just, you never saw the sun. So I'm just going to throw that out right now. Because we're going to talk about China in the course of the day. The second caveat is I'm going to try to keep my comments relatively brief. I mean, I'll go through sort of an outline of U.S. policy in Central Asia, but definitely want to engage in conversation about this. So I will flip through these mercilessly. They're on the computer already, so they're available here. I already, if anyone ever wants copies, it's a lot of maps. I'm kind of a fan of maps. And the third thing I should say, and this is always the sort of remark that gets people, doing the dog listening to a high-pitched sound thing. It's the, technically I do work for the U.S. government. Defense Department, the Near East South Asia Center, the regional center within that National Defense University. And so I always have to do the remark that these comments are my own and not that of the Defense Department or the National Defense University or the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies. Boom, done. And that's good because they don't reflect U.S. policy. I have spent 14 years working in the Defense Department, and it's been a challenge because I think there are a lot of great ideas, there are a lot of very smart people, but sometimes our policies can get a little strange. And we're going to spend a bit of time today explaining why that is and sort of what this means for Central Asia. And you can broadly think, especially if you're Russianists or you work on the Caucasus or other areas, what this might do for you. Now, I sort of put the presentation titled slightly differently because I sort of put it as a question, which we're going to try to answer today. That is there a viable future for U.S. policy in Central Asia? And of course, we should say, yes, there is. It's not a rhetorical question because it's actually one that I think needs serious study today. It's been over 20 years since the U.S. has engaged in the region. And quite frankly, we're now facing a challenging time, and not because there's a massive shift in the countries themselves. If you get a chance to go to Central Asia, or if you've been to Central Asia, you can see incremental changes, and you can even see some cosmetic changes, new buildings, new roads, people with cars, more than before. But institutionally, a lot of things have stayed the same. But in terms of our own policy, clearly, we have had some changes. Just as the, kind of the obligatory historic comment, if you will, in '91, we officially recognized the states of Central Asia, and, a number of you have obviously, heard, and maybe perhaps in seminars, which now I think can fall in the area of history seminars, not, political science or government anymore, but, embassies were set up in hotels, there were shoestring budgets. Literally, it was a case in all 5 countries. The ambassador was given one hotel room, and the other hotel room next to it was the embassy. I was living in Tashkent at the time as actually an IREX researcher, and when the U.S. Embassy opened up in that country, and there were 6 people that came on board. 4 of them were literally told the week before, hey, you're going to Central Asia, you're going to open up an embassy. And the thinking at the time, and I should say, if I say we or our, I'm usually meaning the U.S. government, the thinking was that these were going to be modest outposts, that the function of working in Central Asia was going to come out of Moscow, that we were going to have, in fact, there was one plan even that these would be seen really as deluxe consulates, and our activities would be based out of Moscow. We weren't sure if even these would be independent states. Well, obviously that didn't happen. They decided to open up the embassies full time, and really over the last 20 years it's been a case of engaging with each country as independent states, with embassies, ambassadors, and all the staffs that U.S. government officials will have. In fact, in all 5 countries, the original embassies are now history. They're now in these new sort of deluxe fortresses. There's a model that the U.S. government uses now for overseas embassies. And they basically come in 3 sizes, small, medium, and large. But it's the same design, and they look like sort of Frank Lloyd Wright getting really bored and just making boxes. They sort of, stack up. Well, in Central Asia, they're all the medium to small. I finally saw a big one the other day. I was like, wow, those are big. It's in China. But they're usually the small and medium ones, which means it's a staff of about 30 to 40 people. So suddenly, from 5 to 6 to 30 to 40, that's pretty big. But over time, how did we engage with these states? Pretty simple. If you look through all of our security policies, if you look through our national security strategies, if you look at anything coming out of the White House, and this is going to go from the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush all the way to Barack Obama's second term. So, across parties, doesn't matter. You have your 5 key themes, which is going to be political development, democratization, economic development and free market economies, human rights and social stability, energy development, and for about the first 10 years, energy development was subsumed under economic development, but really since the late 90s, these two have been pulled apart, and actually early part of this last decade, I should say. Energy is now seen as a separate category, and then finally security. And what's happened is that with each of these, they've each had their day in the sun, so to speak. And this is my own categorization. It's not necessarily, there's not some gospel truth on this. But as I look at it, I've already suggested this early recognition. I would say, for the first term of Bill Clinton, and interestingly corresponding with the first term of Boris Yeltsin, we had what I would call a Russia First policy. We loved Yeltsin. We thought what was good for him was good for Russia, and if what was good for him was a greater role in Central Asia, all the better. I mean, we were occupied elsewhere. Again, going back and forth in the region, particularly in Tajikistan during the Civil War, I will tell you that there really wasn't much attention paid in the U.S. Tajik Civil War. In the Russian media, absolutely. You get your day-to-day coverage in Moscow's press. Washington was concerned with things like Bosnia, things elsewhere in the world that were problematic. We sort of had this. Now, I highlight this energy first, and this is important for us because in the second term of Clinton and the second term of Yeltsin, we didn't get along. They personally didn't get along, and suddenly you found U.S. policy getting a little more aggressive. In fact, I should say, yesterday was at an all-day energy conference, and we spent a lot of time looking at energy policy in the region in the 90s versus today, and it's actually fascinating to see the shifts. I mean, back then we talked about competing pipelines, main export pipelines. What would be the dominant route? Would it go through Russia northward, or would it go through this new thing called Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan, which the U.S. was strongly advocating? Openly, the U.S. government never said it was the preferred route. We always said it's whatever the market bears, but, you know, millions of dollars of assistance and Exim Bank credits to help make sure Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan was realized was critical. And in fact, today, oil companies, even British Petroleum, will acknowledge that without U.S. government interference or involvement, BTC would not have happened. But that, you know, we look back at this time and go, wow, that was sort of simple, because, of course, today we know that the pipelines go in all directions. This is not one versus the other. In fact, it's all of them. So this notion of this energy competition, you know, kind of came and went. We moved to 2001, and of course, we all know, with Operation Enduring Freedom, the campaign in Afghanistan following September 11th, our view of Central Asia changes rather dramatically. I will say about 2 years prior to this, in 1999, I was involved in it was an interagency exercise. We had different offices get together and create scenarios where the U.S. military would have a presence in the Caucasus, Caspian region, Central Asia. And we really, you know, it was, you try to create as many crazy scenarios as possible. Like, okay, let's think of something that would really make us want to go there, whether it was oil workers taken hostage in the Caspian, or, you know, road leaders, almost like, you know, it was the movie that later came out, Air Force One, you know, the Harrison Ford thing. That was planned. You know, that was, things like that actually were thought of. And each time the military was, nope, don't see it, don't see us going there, because it's too far, it's a bad neighborhood, logistically isn't going to work. September 11th happens, and of course we go in the region. Now, what did this do? Ultimately, you know, you sort of look at this slide, it just basically says, it changed how we engage with Central Asia, in the sense that security assistance becomes really critical. And if you look at any sort of graph or chart, I would strongly encourage a quick look at whatever the latest version of the Congressional Research Service analysis of Central Asia, and that's, by the way, for all regions, Russia, Middle East, you name it. Jim Nickel is the guy who writes on Russia and Eurasia, but they always, you know, put some data and charts at the end to show you funding, security funding, AID funding, other forms of funding. And you see this huge spike up in 2002, 2003. But also in non-military issues. And that's something that's often forgotten. It wasn't an either or. It wasn't, we're giving money for security reasons, therefore nothing's going to go for economic development, media training, and other things. They actually all kind of rose up. But what happens, I would say, on the negative side is, of course, we're not working in isolation, and we're going to have other groups, China, Russia, these alphabet soups of organizations, Collective Security Treaty Organization, you know, and others, suddenly found an interest. What is the U.S. doing? You know, why are we there? And you know, we realize very quickly that it becomes a catalyst for greater engagement of other countries. That our involvement in the region heightens the interest of other states, Russia notwithstanding. And, you know, this is a great example. You know, the transit center at Manas. This is just a really small snapshot of it. It's actually some of the maintenance quarters, and those are actually some living accommodations. It's a pretty impressive base. You know, it holds about 3.2 million gallons of jet fuel in these huge bladders, these big, basically nylon rubber tanks. And they're constantly full. They're in these burned off areas, and so if they break open, they're not going to hopefully spill that much. But it's really designed, obviously, to supply fuel for air operations in Afghanistan. Ultimately, that's its primary purpose, because jets flying around Afghanistan can't land in that country, so they refuel in the air and head back. But it also is a transit area for troops going in. As I said, a catalyst for other countries' activities. It also, this interest in Central Asia made us rethink even how we look at it. And whether it's the military commands, as you see here, and these are now kind of old, we sort of accept these, but again, at the time, it was something relatively new, both in the Defense Department and in the State Department. you see Central Asia is linked with other countries, not the post-Soviet space anymore. But what we see is Central Asia is now linked with South Asia, with the Middle East, same bureau as Egypt, absolutely, same bureau as Yemen, you got it. So in Tampa, when they discuss security challenges in the region, the analysts, the desk officers who work on Central Asian affairs have to compete with those who work, on some of these other countries, Syria, Iran. In the State Department, same thing. Central Asia is now linked with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. It's not linked with Ukraine and Russia. No surprise, you can think of all sorts of challenges this is going to offer. If you're a Russian speaker and you've been working Eurasian affairs for a number of years, and now you're with people who are speaking, Urdu and Pushtun, other languages, and also just administratively you're going through different chains, it makes it rather complicated. And so this has shaped, I would say, how we look at Central Asia. Now, if we look at the challenges then, what has been our problem? And this is now where we get to some criticisms, and I'm just going to lay out some of these, and then we'll be able to get into a good discussion. And, I've just given a very broad brushstroke of how we've looked at how we've at least attempted to engage in the region. I should say, just as a small rejoinder, on the securitization of our policy, I made a comment about how everything spikes up in 2002, 2003. Since that year, security assistance has actually dropped. We've actually had a decline of about 8 years. The budget for this year is less than it was last year, and the budget for next year will be less than it is for this year. It's actually been going down, but for all categories. Just want to make a clarification on that. But in all of this, as we've engaged, as we've put millions of dollars, lots of effort, at least lots of analysis in the area, ultimately what have been some of the pitfalls in U.S. engagement? First of all, we've tended to view the region as a whole. I'm sure you've heard this before. You probably maybe make this assumption yourself that when we think of Central Asia, we think of it as a collective. All 5 states pretty much are the same. We mirror image them. We assume that the governments and people of Central Asia want to be just like us. So any aid programs, no matter how modest, should result in some disproportionate success. Let's put in a $10,000 media training program, and we're going to get, the next version of Ann Curry or online. Actually, that would have been the Tajik president's daughter, Rahman. She was a news journalist at 16 on TV. But we thought that, of course, that they, anything we would do in areas of economic reform, political reform would be accepted. We had an instrumentalist approach. And what I mean by this is when we've engaged with Central Asia, we've tended to engage with them with respect to something else. Now, I kind of showed those, South Central Asia maps or Middle East maps. Less that to an extent of, in the first decade it was about Russia, but we've also done this vis-a-vis Iran. And of course, for the last decade, 12 years, we've done this with respect to Afghanistan. I guarantee if you were to do a word search on official U.S. documents regarding Central Asia, I bet the word Afghanistan is going to be in that document somewhere. It may even be in the title, Central Asia in light of the Afghan conflict, in light of OEF. And so this has been problematic. We've tended to, as a result, when we view our relations with Central Asian states, and I say with respect to other countries, this has particularly been true with Russia. And when we look at our engagement with Russia, even today, Central Asia comes into play. We think of the Northern Distribution Network, we think of other efforts. Russia has come in. We've also looked at future roles of other states. The great game literature is enormous. I have quite a few books on my shelf that, quite frankly, are worthless because they were written in the 90s or even the last decade, and it was all about great game competition. This battle between, U.S., Russia, China, Turkey, Iran. Let's throw those in. You kind of forget, but at the very beginning, we assumed it was all about Turkey and Iran. That it was either going to be secular Muslim states or, fundamentalist, theocracies. Which one is going to play a role? We wanted Turkey to be our surrogate. Little did we know that Turkey actually had other ambitions, other plans, and while they had an interest in Central Asia, didn't apply the resources because they were looking at Europe, they were looking at the Caucasus, they were looking at the Middle East, other areas. But we tended to see things, and it is, for every public address that says we're not engaging in a great game policy, we're absolutely not doing this, you almost have to say that probably when that speech is over, they go back to a meeting and say, yes, we're not engaging in a great game, but make sure the Russians don't do this. Make sure the Chinese don't do that. So this becomes important. And all of that, of course, was done on the cheap. If you look at the absolute numbers brought into Central Asia, they pale in comparison to other parts of the world. I do a lot of work now with the Middle East states, and I'm stunned at the amount of money that's put into countries there. I'm like, wow, if we had a fraction of this in Central Asia, the things that could be done. And then lastly, and this is particularly important for those around the table here, because as you study this region, and I should say, after 30 years of studying the region, I think I'm a pretty good student. I'm still learning, but you have an interest in what makes different countries tick, what makes different people tick. Sad truth to say is in a lot of government offices you have people who have absolutely no area expertise, and I'm going to throw one more on there, no interest. Maybe you're just biding time. I got this Tajik desk and I'm waiting for something really interesting in Paris. And so you're doing, I remember once riding the metro in DC, and there were these folks who were clearly, government officials at the time. I was still at Johns Hopkins at this time, and the conversation still is in my head because they go, he was obviously trying to impress his female companion with the important work he was doing, and he's like, yes, I'm now working on the stands. The stands are really important countries, those stands. And he just kind of kept saying that. I was like, I bet he doesn't even know what any of them really are. And he sort of thought of them as these objects he's going to move around. Well, the result then is when we've engaged this way, it's no surprise we get some pushback. We get some if you want to say, different approaches from the region. We'll actually get to that in just a sec. Because let's flip it around, and this is the, if you want to say, the important part. I mean, I can spend all this time saying, oh, here's what we did wrong, here's what we did wrong, and we did a lot right, I should say, but some of these shortfalls are critical, because over the past 20 years, well, the Central Asian states themselves, the populations in these countries have changed. I mean, they've developed, they've moved in different directions. They are 5 distinct states. There are populations who are connected with the rest of the world, yes, even in Turkmenistan, who have an understanding, maybe not the same understanding we have, but have an understanding of what's going on in the world. And so right away we have to acknowledge that they are independent states with their own views of national security, national interests, and international relations. Sounds kind of simple, but it's true, and we fail, I think, at times to realize this. Russians fail to realize this, the Russian government. The Chinese government fails to realize this. Sometimes the big powers fail to realize that smaller states have interests. Great example is recently the government of Kazakhstan developed a national security strategy. It's actually their third. There's a scholar by the name of Roger McDermott who's based out of Almaty, and he recently wrote a report on the state of the current national security strategy. He knows Kazakh and Russian and does a very good job in analyzing the sort of what he thinks they mean. I may disagree with certain elements, but I love his analysis. And one of the things that's critical in his analysis is and I saw this in 2007 working with the Kazakh Ministry of Defense, was they had an interest in American national security strategy, had an interest in our advice. And so they brought different teams of Americans out to assist, but they also brought teams of Russians, teams of Chinese. And their national security strategy back in '07 was interesting because they would have concepts like jointness and interoperability. And the Americans go, yeah, that's us, that's us. And then they talk about threats from non-hemispheric states. That's Chinese. And so you find that you realize that they kind of pick and choose. That's what independent states do. They have engaged with other states that are equally concerned with the region. I think we've all too often made an analysis, too much of an analysis on, oh, they now just have a grant from Russia. They now just, they have a $600 million credit from China. This now means they're tilting in that direction. It also means perhaps that they're keeping their options open. You're a small state wedged between some pretty large countries. You have to do this. And by the way, this is the strategy that small and medium states do in Europe. It's what they do in Latin America. It's what they do in Africa, other parts of the world. They understand news and interpret events differently, and through filters that we might not appreciate as much as we could. For example, in the 2008, when Russia and Georgia had their little conflict, whether it was Russia invading Georgia, which many people suggest it is, or if you read the Russian media, it was Georgia invaded South Ossetia and they came in to prevent genocide. All that, I sort of had an odd vantage. I was watching it through the Tajik media, being in Dushanbe at the time. And my goodness, I was so happy those Ossetians were saved, because that was the perspective we got. In fact, it wasn't until I got back to the States, it was like, oh, that's how it went. I didn't know that. Definitely a different turn of it. Now, I will caution by saying that this was during the time of the Olympics, and right after that, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization had a meeting in Dushanbe, and so Tajikistan was the host. The Chinese delegation was furious. They were livid at this whole thing because not only did it spoil the pristine image of the Olympics, here's a conflict happening at the time of the Olympics, but it also violated the notion of territorial integrity, which is what the Chinese are all about. And I should add one last thing on this interpretation, and a lot of it has to do with us. And I suspect some of you, if you've traveled over there, you get this view or perspective yourself. But when they look at the U.S. and they look at our role in the region, how they interpret events, our events, vary. I mentioned national integrity, territorial integrity, national sovereignty. That's exactly the criticism that was levied against us in 2003 during the Iraq War. 2001, 2002, we were loved in the region. September 11th, everyone is an American. 2003, are we next? Was the question often asked. The colored revolutions culminating in 2005 with Kyrgyzstan, the perception, as a lot of you know, really resulted in the acceleration of anti-NGO legislation and restrictions on American and European activities in our countries. With that same year with Andijan, it caused the closure of the base at Manas, and this is just kind of a nice little, Manas, Karshi Khanabad, sort of shows, the bases that came through there. That's really the one that was shut down. We had a lot of offers to do. We tried to develop other bases, but what this did was actually not, in the West we viewed it as a human rights issue, we viewed it as an issue of state oppression. In Central Asia it was viewed as part of a larger strategic discussion about basic rights. And we can go on and on, whether even our declaration of the drawdown in Afghanistan, they view it as abandoning the region. And so, as we engage, and when they look at things we're doing, whether it's this northern distribution network that supports our troops in the region, and we use existing bridges, the Friendship Bridge in Uzbekistan, the bridge at Nizhny-Pyanj in Tajikistan. We cast things as this Silk Road. The Central Asians look at all of this with some skepticism. They sort of question our staying power, they question our motivations. I sort of note this, and we can spend a lot of time on this particular issue, the notion of a modern Silk Road, new Silk Road. This has actually been around since the 90s. Sam Brownbag, Kansas, was the first one to initiate Silk Road legislation in the Senate. Christina Rocca was his staffer. She later becomes Deputy Assistant Secretary for South Asian Affairs, South Central Asian Affairs. Worked on his staff. She was from Kansas. And he sort of an odd story about this. He actually became the leading senator on Central Asian affairs in the 90s. And the logic was simple. You know, when Bob Dole stepped down to run for president, he comes in office, and he immediately runs to the senior sort of doyens in the Republican Party, you know, Richard Lugar and these other people, and says, you know, I want to work on the Arab-Israeli issue, and I want to solve that problem. And Lugar tells him, you gotta be kidding. You know, pick something that can work. Kind of looked around, and actually Christina Roca was like, Central Asia. No one knows anything about it. No one's doing anything on it. It was perfect, and he was well regarded in the region, and so he develops a Silk Road legislation, which actually was an east-west corridor. You know, we think of it as a north-south thing, but his view was east-west because it was to avoid Russia, and it was to avoid Iran. Now, the EU at the same time also had a Silk Road legislation that included Russia and Iran, and the Chinese had a Silk Road legislation that really didn't include anybody but China and Central Asia. So everyone was working on this. You know, we engage in border security issues, and ultimately, and this is what we're kind of going to end with now, is, okay, we've developed these different issues, we've developed these other efforts. What are our interests today? You know, can we still, after all this experience, can we still create some viable policy? And we're doing this already in an era where we're saying we're moving in different directions. We talk about our pivot to Asia or our rebalancing. We changed the language. It confuses people in the region. I was getting an earful from the Chinese, the PLA in particular. It's like, what is this rebalance? What does this mean? What what is it about us? Also within, other policies, the Arab Spring, whether it's Libya, Syria, whatever, the Central Asian states collectively, and there's going to be variation among them, sort of realize that we're moving in different directions. Ultimately, what this means is we've changed the order of some of those ideas I've mentioned before, maybe modified it, is I would look at our post-2014 world as still focusing on the hard security questions, the Manas Transit Center, this northern distribution network, and ultimately whatever this policy of a new Silk Road. Border security, critical, energy is key. And then at the end, and I don't mean to just sort of put this all, in fact, maybe should have put it in smaller type, but unfortunately it has become a lesser placed policy, that is democratization, human rights, and humanitarian assistance. It's mentioned, but the amount of time and attention, funding is much less. And in fact, this is going to be a challenge that we are going to face, I would say, in the next decade for sure, which is, in fact, the budget's not going to change. In fact, it's going to decrease. This goes for anything from security assistance to even educational assistance. I work a lot with IREX and some of the other grant agencies, and it's scary how people are re-examining, whether it's Title VI, Title VIII monies, and also security assistance. Cutting all of these makes things difficult engaging in Central Asia. And so what we've decided is, to some extent, on a national level, you start to see a different way of looking at the region. That is, we have these goals, but now the way in which we can include them means we're going to have to work with others. We're going to have to work with other states. Recently, for example, there's been a lot more discussion of India. India could be our partner in Central Asia. Sort of like how Turkey was in the 90s. I don't know if the Indians have quite gotten the message yet. Their Central Asianists, by the way, feel that they're underfunded, underappreciated, and understaffed. India is looking in other directions as well. Central Asia is one of them. And so you start to see, in the last couple of years, comments like, well, maybe on certain security issues, things like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, could become, relevant, viable partners in the region. Practically speaking, supporting construction programs in Central Asia. This is a tunnel in Tajikistan built by Iranians. It's now being rebuilt by the Chinese. So we like the rebuilding part. We don't like the original design. And by the way, neither do the Tajiks. This is, it's often called the Tunnel of Doom, which leads to the Valley of Death on the other side. It's a 5-kilometer tunnel with no lighting. And it's, they forgot drainage, and so it floods a lot. And last September I had a chance to drive through, and you're just sort of avoiding potholes, and every once in a while you see a guy with a wheelbarrow, and you just try to avoid hitting them. But it's Chinese now, it's Chinese labor, and that's developing this. And by the way, the Tajiks are suing the Iranians for breach of contract. They gave them a substandard product. Oil pipelines going in other areas, and just ultimately, and this is what I'll leave you with, is are we in a situation where we are now deferring to other powers? You get this conversation in Washington now as far as you get the one dialogue which says, yeah, we need to work with partners, we need to do things, and then the sort of, if you want to call them the America First or the AEI crowd goes, oh my God, we've sold the farm. We're losing this region, and we're basically giving it to the Chinese and the Russians. So the Great Game mentality or the Cold War mentality is still in place. What I would say, and we can then discuss this, is well, ultimately, what can we do? Well, what we can't do is go back to the 90s. We can't go back to an era where we were greatly appreciated, everything was new, and quite frankly, the American dollar went very, very far. They've grown up, they have options, they work with options. They work with countries around the world. Qatar, United Arab Emirates are investing in Central Asia, not just sort of the big external powers. And so when we engage, the understanding is, well, we play a part, but not a huge part. Can we continue education exchanges? That used to be, actually, I would say, our most productive and valuable effort and engagement in the region, particularly Central Asians coming to the US, but also Americans going there. Absolutely, this battle is taking place this spring on the Hill. Can there be funding for Central Asian engagement? And I would say for other countries as well, Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, you name it. We don't, we need to include the security forces, armed forces, and we tend to separate them, and I think ultimately we do need to engage with all levels of society. These are authoritarian regimes, or at least regimes that don't exactly have strong democratic traditions. Kyrgyzstan is perhaps moving in another direction, but we can discuss that. How do we engage with other forces? Can we play chicken with human rights? Can we, do an either or? Quite frankly, that doesn't work. What we're finding is, much like other states, let's say China as an example, if we put sanctions or we limit assistance based on human rights, the response is, okay, that's fine. It's not exactly a stick anymore we can play. Human rights have to be addressed. It just has to be addressed perhaps in a different manner. Access to information, critical. And in particular, I would say what we mean and do what we say. One of the criticisms we've had over the last 20 years is we promised a lot. And Americans do that. We want to do everything. We want to help the world. We want to save the world. And so we go, yeah, we can do that. And then 3 years later, the project may actually happen on a reduced budget. Well, because there's a reality. And that's what frustrates them. And then in the end, prepare to balance. Prepare to not be the major player, but a player in a region that's important, but obviously in terms of broader U.S. national security interests, maybe not the most important as much as I think all of us might say, but it is. This is critical. There's obviously some limitations. And just lastly, and I'll leave it at this, think long term. Was at a meeting down in Tampa at CENTCOM not too long ago, and there was a discussion about thinking in terms of challenges on the on the horizon and what's ahead, and that means 2014, 2015. For the U.S. that's long term. In Beijing right now, in their actually at the PLA, at their Advanced Military Studies school, I should say, when they're looking long term, they're looking 50 years or more. That's long term. And we have a long term engagement program. Oh, it's like till 2060. Wow. We don't think of even 2030, let alone 60. But that's something to consider. Anyway, I've gone on a little bit longer than expected, so sorry about that, but definitely happy to open it up for questions, comments, and any other remarks on Central Asia or other issues. No basketball comments though. I'm in mourning as well.